Berserk begins a few years after a terrible solar eclipse, which was one of the signs of the appearance of the Angel of Darkness. The Holy Iron Chain Knights wearing shining armor arrived at the edge of a lake that had been the site of a battle. In addition to a solar eclipse, the prophecy also mentions that a blood-red lake is a sign of the appearance of the Angel of Darkness who will bring havoc to the entire world. The scene then switches and shows the atmosphere in a small town without law, where violence is everywhere, and corpses are left lying on the streets. In a tavern, a red-haired boy who was overwhelmed brought a few beers to a group of bandits who were loyal customers of the tavern. Not far from where they were sitting, they saw a bandit playing and torturing a male elf named Puck. Puck struggled to free himself from the ropes around his neck, but his efforts seemed in vain. On the other hand, the red-haired boy looked annoyed and scolded the bandit for only making him an errand boy, though the boy followed them to learn how to fight and use the sword. However, the bandit suddenly became angry and instead beat the boy. At the same time, a man of large stature and carrying a large sword on his back arrived there and immediately beat up the bandit for blocking his way. A fight between the man against a group of bandits was inevitable. However, the man named Guts managed to win the fight and gave some money to the tavern owner for the losses caused by their fight. After buying a bottle of water for the trip, Guts left. In the evening, Guts decided to rest in the middle of the forest and make a bonfire to warm himself. While eating his meal, Puck, who had managed to break free, appeared before Guts and continued chatting about his life story. Puck then warns Guts about the bandits hiding in the forest and asks him to be careful. However, Guts, annoyed that Puck didn't stop talking, threatened to burn him if the elf continued to bother him. Fearing Guts, Puck finally walks away from him. Long story short, when Guts continued his journey by walking through the woods in the middle of the night, he met an old man named Adolf and his daughter, Colette, who offered him a ride. However, Guts immediately rejected the offer for the safety of the old man and his daughter while telling him that he was being watched by evil spirits who could endanger their lives. However, Adolf insisted that he would be fine because he believed in Almighty God. On the other hand, Puck, who was near Colette, mocked Guts with a ridiculous facial expression until Guts finally decided to accept the offer from Adolf after several pairs of red eyes glared at him from the darkness of the forest behind him. Colette then offered Guts a bottle of wine to warm him up, but Guts refused because he didn't want to dull his senses in a situation to watch out for like this, especially when he was being targeted by an evil spirit. Colette, who saw Guts' prosthetic arm, seemed curious about it and asked him. Guts says he lost his left arm in the fight. After introducing themselves, Colette then complimented Guts for defending Puck and the red-haired boy at the tavern. Knowing that Guts is a mercenary, Adolf tries to advise him to choose another profession that does not involve violence. However, Guts had chosen his own path in life because he was destined to fight the evil spirits. As Guts drifts off to sleep, he experiences nightmares that give rise to painful flashes of the past when the woman he loved, Casca, was harassed by Griffith. Guts, who angrily called Griffith's name in his dream, then woke up and managed to kill an evil spirit embodiment monster that attacked him. The incident wakes Puck and the others who wonder where the monster came from. Guts explained that the monster was an evil spirit that was born from a nightmare and made human fear as its food. Realizing that the evil spirits targeting him were getting closer, Guts then prepared and took his sword to face them. Guts tells Adolf and the others that the evil spirits come from the spirits of dead humans. Since the forest they were currently in was the former of a great battle in the past, the evil spirits targeting him might be countless. Guts then asked Adolf and Colette to stay in the carriage. However, because of the evil aura enveloping the place, their horses became restless and tried to free themselves from the reins. Adolf and his daughter were desperate to get out to calm their horses. But then, herds of armed demon skeletons attacked from all sides, killing them. Guts tried his best to defeat the herd of demon skeletons. Puck, who saw Guts surrounded by a herd of demon skeletons, suggested that he just run away. However, Guts told the elf he was used to dealing with them. He then took out a large sword, his main weapon, which could slay the demon skeletons with one slash. Puck then warns Guts about Colette being possessed by an evil spirit and preparing to attack him. Even though Colette manages to stab Guts, he ends up killing Colette with his sword. After successfully defeating a herd of demon skeletons, Guts, who was resting, was suddenly attacked from underground by the roots of the demon tree, which then wrapped around his body and made it difficult for him to move. However, with his multifunctional and modified prosthetic arm, he freed himself from the restraints of the demon tree's roots. Using his great sword, Guts managed to destroy the roots of the demon tree, and his struggle to defeat the evil spirits ended at dawn. The sun's rays then freed all the spirits trapped in the demon skeleton that Guts had defeated in the battle last night. Seeing Colette's mangled body, Puck tries to comfort Guts by saying that the death of Colette and her father is not his fault. However, Guts, who heard Puck's words, laughed out loud while saying that people who died in other people's battles were weak people, and he didn't care about them at all. He then took his sword and prepared to continue his journey while the evil spirits whispered nearby, telling him that they would keep an eye on him and follow him wherever he went, as long as he still had the mark on his neck. Angry Guts then fired cannonballs from his cannon arm everywhere. After that, he continued his journey with Puck following behind him. Sometime later, Guts met the Holy Iron Chain Knights, who immediately surrounded him because he was the Black Swordsman they had been looking for. The leader of the Knights, a woman named Farnese, told Guts that they had been ordered by the Holy See to capture him. The Holy See is a very influential organization whose pontifical body rules over a major monotheistic religion. The Holy See's parochial influence stretches wide across multiple world domains. Their insignia resembles a falcon in flight, with two orbs forming a helix around it. The Holy See monopolizes the wealth of the world while removing potential threats to itself, which includes the worship of benign astral beings and the practice of magic, which is seen as heresy. As its doctrine spread throughout the world, the ancient gods were forgotten and faded into the depths of the astral world. The Holy See also wrote scripture, one such prophetic document foretelling the coming of an angel known as the Falcon of Darkness, which would come when the sun dies 5 times, and call down upon the world an age of darkness. When Farnese ordered Guts to put down his weapon and surrender himself, Guts refused and chose to fight against them. However, those knights were no match for Guts because they were just spoiled sons of nobles who didn't even have experience on the real battlefield, so Guts could easily defeat them. Seeing the defeat of the other knights, the vice commander of the Holy Iron Chain Knights, a man named Azan, then intervened to face Guts alone. Azan, who was far more experienced on the battlefield than the other knights, could match Guts' fighting ability and overwhelm him. Guts, who chose to run away from the fight because Azan might be able to defeat him sooner or later, jumped high into the air and charged at Farnese. Farnese, who saw this, drew her sword and injured Guts, causing him to collapse unconscious. Everyone looked astonished to see Farnese being able to overthrow Guts, even though this was the first time that woman had stabbed someone. After that, Guts was taken to the Holy Iron Chain Knights camp, where he was immediately brought into Farnese's tent so that she could more freely interrogate him about the solar eclipse events several years ago. However, Guts diverts the conversation by mentioning Farnese, who is considered to have mental problems related to her belief in God. Farnese, who then felt irritated, told Guts to shut his mouth and threatened to kill him if he continued to mock her belief in Almighty God. While looking through Guts' belongings, Farnese seemed interested in what she thought was one of the items he used to worship idols. But again, Guts refused to serve the overly curious Farnese and asked her if she had ever met the god she had been worshipping. Farnese firmly said that the god she worshipped was in heaven and in the souls of the worshippers, making it impossible for them to see the god they worshipped. Hearing Farnese's answer, which he thought was ridiculous, Guts laughed out loud while mocking her belief in the religion she had been following. An irritated Farnese then whipped Guts multiple times, but she immediately realized that Guts didn't seem to be in pain and ordered Azan to lock him up. Guts was then placed in an animal enclosure whose roof was only covered with a tarp. That night, Guts realized that the evil spirits were starting to target him from all sides, including from underground. He then thought of a way to deal with the evil spirits in such a shackled state. When Guts is at an impasse, Puck suddenly appears before him with a key that can open the chains that bind him. Having managed to free himself, Guts then rushed to Farnese's tent to get his weapons and equipment back. Guts, who had sneaked into Farnese's tent, saw her shirtless and whipping herself in front of the altar of worship as a punishment for neglecting her duties. After rendering Farnese unconscious, Guts then took back his clothes, weapons and equipment and left there while taking Farnese as his prisoner so that Azan and the other knights would not resist and let him go. On the other hand, Farnese's servant, who is also her half-brother, Serpico, didn't just let Guts take Farnese away. Serpico immediately spurred his horse to chase Guts. When Serpico was about to attack Guts with his bow guns, suddenly he was blocked by the evil spirits who surrounded him and scared his horse, causing him to fall. Meanwhile, Puck, who saw the herd of evil spirits getting closer to them, warned Guts to prepare for their attack. Guts then drew his greatsword and slashed at the flock of the evil spirits that were attacking him while continuing to spur his horse at high speed. Farnese, approached by one of the evil spirits, seemed shocked because of their terrifying appearance. She turned out to be the first time seeing the evil spirits, which Guts referred to as a miracle sent by God to this world. Meanwhile, Serpico, who was watching Guts from the top of the hill, estimated that he was heading to the abandoned area of the Lansdowne Manor complex. The castle was once built by a nobleman to channel his hobby of hunting and relax to relieve his work's boredom and fatigue. 5 years ago, there was a big fire incident that killed the nobleman and all his employees. Guts finally got there. However, upon entering the castle grounds, the horse revolted, which caused Guts and Farnese to fall. Not long after, a pack of dogs possessed by an evil spirit appeared and surrounded the two of them. Guts then told Farnese that the herd of demon dogs was a true miracle. As the herd of dogs grew in number, Guts then took Farnese and his horse to enter the castle and find a hiding place. However, the herd of demon dogs managed to barge in, so Guts couldn't help but confront them. On the other hand, a frightened Farnese flees into a dark alley, where she meets a wrinkled dwarf who claims to be the dog's caretaker. Farnese then asks the man to untie the knot. Seeing Guts massacre his dogs, the dwarf suddenly felt angry and vowed to kill him for what he had done to his dogs. Guts seemed to have realized that the man was the one who killed the owner of the castle and everyone in it. However, the dwarf man told him that he did not kill them but preyed on them. The midget man seemed interested in Farnese and wanted to prey on her, but before he could do so, Guts had already stabbed the midget in the mouth, revealing his true form, a monster. Guts and the monster then engage in a fierce battle. As Guts battles the monster, Puck approaches the statue of a woman's face at the top of the stairs. Puck initially felt something odd with the statue, then touched it. With his strength, Puck was able to find out the past of the owner of the mansion and what terrible events happened to them because apparently, the statue is a piece of the owner's daughter's body. In the past, that young girl was the only person who treated him kindly and gently. However, because of his extreme hatred for the master, he made the young girl a sacrifice to the god Hand, a quadrumvirate of demon sovereigns who act as executors of the idea of evils will under their desires being intrinsic to the entities. Feeling guilty after killing someone who had been so kind to him, the monster then made a display statue of the young girl's body. Puck, who touched the display statue, managed to distract the monster's attention so that Guts could knock it down. When the monster is helpless, Guts then tortures the monster to get information about God Hand and then kills the monster when he doesn't get any information. On the other hand, Farnese had apparently fled from there as Guts interrogated the monster, being confronted by a horse possessed by an evil spirit. Luckily, Guts got there in time and saved her after decapitating the horse with just one slash of his sword. Guts then warned Farnese not to run away from him if she wanted to stay alive, and Farnese complied. As they walked down the dark alleys of the castle, Farnese looked frustrated and disappointed in herself because she was more focused on running away than praying and asking Almighty God for help, whereas all this time, Farnese had thought of herself as an obedient servant to the god. However, in that doubt, Farnese was possessed by an evil spirit that tested her faith in God, revealing the darkest secret of Farnese, who recently whipped herself not because of penance for the mistakes she had made but because of sheer desire when faced with shirtless Guts. Farnese, whose faith had faltered for a long time, then gave in to the evil spirit that had suddenly taken over her body. She then attacked Guts while seducing him. However, Guts knew that Farnese had been possessed and chose not to act rashly. Before long, dawn broke, and the sun shone through the hole in the wall, illuminating the dark passage. Farnese finally came to her senses because the evil spirit that possessed her body had disappeared. Realizing what she was about to do while being completely naked, Farnese screamed and burst into tears. At the same time, Serpico finally arrived there and immediately helped Farnese. Serpico then tells Guts that he will not catch him this time and lets him go. However, Serpico surprises Guts with his ability to wield a sword. He then said goodbye to Guts and followed Farnese, who had walked away. Puck, who saw them off, then told Guts that he felt a deep sadness radiating from Farnese as if she was trapped in an invisible prison. The scene then switches and shows the residents of the city of Windham who gather in the palace square because they are worried about the king's deteriorating health condition. Before the king fell ill, all the residents had the same dream about the calamity that would come and hit their land. Not only do they have terrible nightmares, but the residents also have dreams that indicate the arrival of the Falcon of Light, who will get rid of the Age of Darkness, stop all disasters from happening, and save them all. The scene turns to the present. At the end of his life, in a dying and weak condition, the king calls out the name of his daughter, Charlotte, and asks to be reunited with her. A general named Laban tries to convince Charlotte to leave the room and meet her dying father. However, Charlotte refuses to meet the king she no longer considers a father and still misses Griffith, the only man she loves. When death came upon him, the king called out Griffith's name, and outside the palace, the bell rang several times, signaling that the king had died. When all the inhabitants of Windham mourn the death of their king, their enemy, the Kushan army, appears on the horizon. The scene then switches and shows people gathered with torches and surrounding Casca, who is tied to a pole, about to be burned by the people. But as it turned out, the sight was just a nightmare experienced by Guts, who fell asleep while leaning against a large pile of rocks. Guts, who then got up from there, saw an evil spirit that resembled Casca's face from inside the rock crevice. The evil spirit warns Guts about the imminent disaster in the Holy Land and asks him to hurry there. Hearing this, Guts immediately realized that the disaster might be related to the nightmare he was experiencing and also related to Casca. Guts rushed to a place where he met a little girl named Erica, who nursed Guts back to health while he was unconscious after the horrific events of the solar eclipse. Erica, who was very happy with Guts' return, then took him to her house to meet Rickert, a boy whom Guts had saved in a battle some time ago. Rickert, who had seemed happy when he met Guts, turned gloomy and looked down sadly when Guts asked about Casca's condition. Rickert informed that Casca had left. Knowing that Casca had disappeared somewhere, Guts was instantly furious and scolded Rickert. However, Erica then defends Rickert and reveals to Guts that Casca's disappearance was her fault. Rickert informed that a month ago, Casca's condition had worsened, so Erica took the initiative to comfort her by taking her for a walk in the forest. When Erica was careless, Casca suddenly disappeared. Hearing this, Guts then blamed Rickert for not trying to find Casca. However, Erica then blames Guts for choosing to go and abandon Casca for the past 2 years. Erica informs that Rickert has been trying to find Casca all along, and he could have looked for Casca further afield. Still, Rickert realized he had to go back because he didn't want to leave Erica and her adoptive father, Godo, lying in bed sick upstairs. Guts then meets Godo, the old man who has saved him, who is now trying to cover up the disease that is eating away at his body, and argues that old age caused his body to be in this pathetic condition. After examining Guts' large sword and prosthetic arm, Godo realized that for the past 2 years, Guts had gone through various battles only to turn to hatred and take revenge for all that had happened to Casca. Godo tells Guts that revenge will only lead to the misery that will never end. However, Guts emphasized that no one could understand his situation. Moreover, Guts has also lost very important people in his life. Guts thinks that no one will experience the greatest loss of their life as he has. Hearing this, Godo said that Guts was selfish because he chose to leave Casca 2 years ago, even though at that time, Casca was in the worst condition of her life due to trauma after experiencing a very terrible event. Instead of accompanying Casca and always by her side, Guts chose to run away, allowing himself to be ruled by his own hatred. Godo then questions whether Guts still deserves to talk about revenge for what happened to him after Guts chose to leave Casca alone to face the trauma and endless suffering. Hearing Godo's words, Guts couldn't help but be silent and unable to reply to the old man's words. After that, Erica and Rickert took Guts to the edge of a cliff, where many swords were stuck in the ground. Rickert told Guts that he had forged all the swords and placed them there as symbols of the graves of the soldiers who had fought with him some time ago, even though they were not buried there. Guts then turned to Rickert and looked at him with admiration, for he had grown old enough to endure the death of his friends and find a way to start a new life, while he is still sinking in the puddle of guilt and ambition for revenge. That night, Guts, who couldn't close his eyes without his sword near him, recalled the terrible events that had befallen Casca and realized that for the rest of his life, he would not be able to rid himself of it, so he was determined to face it all on his own. Guts is then determined to find Casca, saving her because he doesn't want to lose the most precious person in his life anymore. On the other hand, Rickert, who was repairing Guts' prosthetic arm, was surprised by Godo's appearance, who forced himself to forge Guts' greatsword, even though he was seriously ill. In fact, Godo not only forged Guts' sword but also made a new suit of armor for him. After Rickert repaired his prosthetic arm and provided some supplies for his journey, Guts then told him that he was going to the nearby Holy Land. Rickert points out that the Holy Land Guts was referring to was probably an old church called St. Albion, also known as the Tower of Conviction, filled with refugees. Knowing there were rumors of the witch trial being held soon, Guts felt certain that Casca was there, according to his previous vision. Rickert begs Guts to find Casca and bring her back to them. After saying goodbye to Godo and Rickert, Guts rushed off to St. Albion. Meanwhile, the Holy Iron Chain Knights were seen making a convoy to St. Albion elsewhere. Farnese, who was at the forefront leading the convoy, looked gloomy as she was still thinking about the terrible events she had experienced with Guts. Farnese tried to push the memory of the incident out of her mind and thought of it as a mere nightmare. After all, she still thought of herself as an obedient servant of God and would never fall into the puddle of sin. On the other hand, residents who wanted to evacuate to St. Albion saw Farnese and her knights escorting a horse-drawn carriage with red wheels, which was the hallmark of the Inquisitor Bishop Mazgas, who was known as a cruel priest who would not hesitate to torture anyone deemed apostate of the religion professed by the Holy See. Mazgas, who has punished about 500 people in the name of God's law, has become the target of hatred by residents whose families or relatives have become victims of his violence, so he is often used as a target for murder. Not long after that, a group of rebels appeared who attacked the convoy of the Holy Iron Chain Knights, where they targeted Mazgas in a horse carriage to avenge their families who had become victims. But then, Mazgas and his executioners got out of the horse carriage and instantly finished off the people with their torture equipment that could slaughter several people at once. Seeing the appearance of Mazgas, Farnese then knelt before him and apologized for all the chaos that had occurred. Mazgas said that it was God's will, and the fact that neither Farnese and her knights were injured in the attack meant that God had bestowed grace on his obedient servants. One of the surviving rebels was later arrested. The man later revealed that they were actually a group of residents whose village was burned by Mazgas for being accused of being a hideout for the infidels after they delayed delivering the prescribed offerings. However, the man argued that they had delayed handing over the offerings because they were experiencing a prolonged famine. Mazgas instead told the man that the disaster that hit their village was God's punishment because they were infidels. Hearing this, the man immediately questioned God's law, which had always been touted by Mazgas, which he thought was very deviant. Because the man questioned God's law in front of him, Mazgas then became very angry and hit a very thick holy book on his head. Mazgas then asked his executioners to immediately conduct a simple trial of the man with the torture tools they had prepared. The gruesome sight clearly made everyone who witnessed it shudder in fear. But that was not the case with Farnese, who seemed to be enjoying the suffering and pain the man was in. When an old man who was one of the rebels was about to go to trial, he tried to run away and hit a woman, who was none other than Casca. Luckily, a woman named Luca standing nearby helped Casca and said she was not part of the rebels. After that, Luca took Casca away from there. The scene then switches and shows a red-haired boy who is being confronted by bandits in an abandoned village. The boy named Isidoro managed to get the remnants of food left by the residents, but the bandits intended to snatch the food. Isidoro insisted that he would not share the food with anyone because he had gone to great lengths to get it. The bandits then threatened Isidoro, so he had no choice but to hand the food over to them. However, after the gang of bandits ate the food, they immediately became sick and vomited because, it turned out, Isidoro had poisoned the food. Isidoro then revealed that he had anticipated this, so he hid his food under his clothes to prevent it from being stolen. Since the bandits had been poisoned, Isidoro could easily defeat them. However, when other bandits arrived and asked Isidoro what had happened to their gang, he lied by saying that they had been attacked by the Kushan army, the enemy of the Kingdom of Midland. Not long after, the Kushan soldiers arrived there and immediately slaughtered the bandits. Isidoro, surprised by the sudden appearance of the Kushan soldiers, then rushed to hide before they killed him. When one of the Kushan soldiers was about to kill Isidoro, Guts arrived there after a long journey. Isidoro immediately recognized Guts because they had met at a tavern some time ago when Guts saved him. Guts, who was walking in such a hurry, then asked the Kushan soldiers to get out of the way because they were blocking his way. However, the Kushan soldiers attacked Guts instead, leaving him no choice but to draw his greatsword and slaughter them all. Isidoro was so astonished to see Guts' action that he could finish off the Kushan soldiers very easily without anyone's help, then decided to follow him. Meanwhile, several people from the Bakiraka clan were observing Guts on a hill not far from there. Bakiraka is a clan of assassins within the Kushan Empire, led by Silet. Several years ago, Silet had fought with Guts and was defeated by that man. For this reason, Silet decided not to fight against Guts when he massacred the Kushan soldiers and wisely told his bodyguards that they might be able to beat him, but not without suffering losses. The scene turns to the refugee camp near the Tower of Conviction, where we can see the refugees whose conditions are very pathetic due to rampant hunger until, one by one, they finally die. The hungry refugees even dared to intercept the royal guards who were about to send food to the Church of St. Albion because they could no longer endure hunger for days. One of them was a woman who wanted to feed her toddler son. Seeing the refugees stealing food, Farnese then lectured them on behaving like honorable and obedient servants of God, and stealing did not reflect oneself as an obedient servant of God. However, the woman then begged Farnese to let her take the food because her son was dying and needed help as soon as possible. Not long after that, Mazgas arrived there and instead appreciated the woman's actions because she was desperate to steal to save her son. Mazgas then ordered Farnese and her knights to bring the woman and some of the people who committed the theft into the church. The woman's child immediately received the best treatment and care from the doctors in the church. Mazgas also informed that he had sent a letter to the leadership of the Holy See asking them to deliver food supplies to the refugees in St. Albion. Hearing this, the woman then thanked Mazgas for being so kind to them. However, Mazgas told the woman that as a believer in God, she had to do something first. Mazgas then took Farnese and the woman to a room where he tortured several people. They looked shocked and frightened to see the horror before them, where the executioners of Mazgas were torturing the people who had committed the theft. Mazgas told the woman that she had done a commendable deed to save her starving son. However, the woman had also committed the sin of stealing food supplies that were about to be delivered to the church. Because of that, she had to atone for her sins by being tortured in that place. After that, The arrests of people who were considered infidels or committed sins continued to be carried out by Farnese and her knights in the refugee camp. They take turns patrolling to keep an eye on the refugees living around the Tower of Conviction. Meanwhile, Luca was seen doing her job as a prostitute in one of the refugee tents. She had a regular customer, a man named Jerome, who was both a noble and one of the Holy Iron Chain Knights. While making out, Luca and Jerome were surprised by the sudden appearance of Casca in their tent. Luca introduces Casca as Elaine because she doesn't know her real name and tells Jerome that Casca is her sister who suffers from a certain disease that requires some parts of her body, including her face, to be wrapped in bandages. However, Luca did that to hide a strange mark on Casca's body. She worries about Casca's safety, choosing to cover the mark because she doesn't want Casca to be considered the witch and punished by Mozgus. After Jerome paid for her services with a pearl necklace and some gold coins, Luca summoned the young women who were her juniors in the profession. Despite living in a refugee camp with a standard of living below the poverty line, Luca is one of the few people who still have the conscience to make those around her happy by setting aside a portion of her income to help residents in need and listening to the complaints of those around her people. As much as possible, she encourages them to continue living and not succumb to the suffering or poverty they experience. Because Luca still has to do her job, she then asks one of her friends, a woman named Nina, to look after Casca and give her medicine. Towards evening, Nina took Casca to the river bank to fetch water. There, Nina laments her life filled with misery and is frustrated by her complicated situation, including the strange disease she is suffering from. Nina didn't realize that the evil spirits had possessed the bodies of the refugees around them because they were attracted by the marks on Casca's body, where the marks had almost the same function as Guts' marks, which could attract the evil spirit's attention. Meanwhile, in another place, Isidoro, who had been following Guts, found out that he was sleeping while leaning on a tree trunk. Isidoro tried to lift Guts' greatsword, but he was so overwhelmed that he accidentally dropped the greatsword and instead woke Guts, who took his sword. Guts then asks Isidoro why he followed him, to which Puck assumes that Isidoro wants to be Guts' apprentice. However, Isidoro insists that he doesn't want to be anyone's disciple or be tied to anything, as he only believes in himself. Hearing this, Guts smiled faintly because Isidoro reminded him of the past, who also never trusted anyone and didn't want to be attached to anything. Guts then asked Isidoro to stop following him because it would be very dangerous to be around him, especially at night. However, Isidoro refused Guts' request, so Guts couldn't help but show why he asked Isidoro to stop following him. Towards night, the evil spirits began to appear and possess the bodies of the refugees who were victims of Mozgus torture some time ago. Isidoro looked so surprised because this was the first time he had seen such terrible creatures and was surprised to see Guts seem to be used to dealing with them. On the other hand, Guts seemed so excited to face the evil spirits because he had made up his mind and accepted his destiny. As night fell, Nina didn't seem to notice the herd of evil spirits approaching them, while Casca just stood there staring at them, not knowing what to do. Not far from there, the demon child who had been watching Casca appeared. The demon child is the offspring of Guts and Casca, brought into the physical world as a small misshapen imp after being tainted by Griffith of the pregnant Casca. When the undead possessed by the evil spirits finally awaken, the demon child tries to prevent the evil spirits from attacking Casca. Even by looking at them, the demon child could exorcise the evil spirits and send them to the afterlife. Casca, who seemed interested in the existence of the demon child, immediately rushed over there. However, Nina, who realized they had been there too long and Luca would be worried if they didn't come back, grabbed Casca's arm and took her away. Elsewhere, Guts, who managed to defeat his enemies, then rushed to St. Albion because he wanted to save Casca immediately. But on the way, he crosses paths with the Skull Knight, who reveals the God Hand are using St. Albion as the site of a ritual to restore Griffith's corporeal form. The Skull Knight then tells Guts that his dream about the Falcon of Darkness is an omen of the appearance of a figure who will bring disaster to the entire world. Furthermore, the Skull Knight tells Guts that he and Casca will again be involved in a terrible event that is not much different from before and that no one will be able to stop this terrible event from happening. If previously Guts and Casca managed to survive with the help of the Skull Knight, this time Guts said that he would use his own power to save Casca. Hearing that, the Skull Knight seemed a little impressed with Guts and said the marks on his body might help him. Before leaving, the Skull Knight suggested that Guts be concerned about the safety of only one person. The next day, Farnese seemed to have no appetite after seeing Mozgus' torture of the food thieves. Because of that, she had intended to meet Mozgus to talk about the welfare of the residents living in the refugee camp. Accompanied by Serpico, Farnese headed to the place where Mazgas was. They were then escorted by one of Mazgas' executioners, who revealed that the executioners were formerly people who were ostracized by society because of their physical condition. However, Mazgas saved their lives, so they are willing to do anything for him, even though they don't like the job. Farnese and Serpico were then taken to the chapel, where Mazgas performed the ritual of praying to God by throwing himself down many times. After completing the ritual, Mazgas went to Farnese, who told her his knee was injured. Mazgas doesn't seem to care about the hurt or pain he gets while praying because it's a testament to his faith in God. Farnese then revealed her intention and purpose in coming to meet Mazgas, where she apparently thought that the methods used by the Holy See and Mazgas to increase the residents' faith were too excessive. Moreover, the residents live in misery, so all they think about all this time is how to survive. However, Mazgas assured Farnese that they had done the right thing according to what God had ordained, and it was proper for them to do whatever it took for the glory of their God. Hearing Mazgas' brief lecture that was so heartwarming, Farnese immediately fell to her knees and no longer questioned anything because she was convinced that all of this was indeed the path that God had destined for them. Meanwhile, no one knew that the mysterious observer was watching them from a height. In the refugee camp, Nina was seen distributing food to the hungry residents, as Luca had previously instructed. Not long after, a young man named Joachim, who is her recurring customer, approached Nina to ask her how she was. Joachim seemed to know about Nina's illness and was worried about her condition. Nina then uses Joachim's sincerity to test whether he really loves her by asking him to come to the riverbank at midnight to meet her. Long story short, Joachim came to see Nina in the middle of the night, proving that he had indeed fallen in love with her. Nina then took Joachim somewhere and didn't realize that Luca had been following them because she suspected Nina's movements that seemed odd lately. However, unbeknownst to Luca, Casca was secretly following her with a herd of evil spirits following behind her. Nina turns out to take Joachim to a pagan association performing a ritual held by the pagan cult's goat-headed leader. Joachim gradually engages until he learns that the pagans are cannibals and try to flee, but he falls off a cliff. On the other hand, Luca, who finally found out that Nina was a follower of a cult, seemed so surprised because she did not expect that Nina was involved with pagans. Luca then met Nina at the cliff's edge crying in disappointment because Joachim chose to run away rather than join her in the cult. Surprised by Luca's presence, Nina threw stones at her to chase her away. However, Luca did not stay silent and then slapped Nina in the face and scolded her to the full before finally forgiving her when she promised to leave the cult. Not long after, Luca finally discovered that Casca had followed her all this time. At the same time, the pagans who met Casca and looked curious about the bandage covering her face then forcibly tore off the bandage on her face and accidentally exposed her clothes so that the marks on her chest became visible. Casca nearly gets harassed by the pagans but is saved by the evil spirits attracted by her mark, which eventually possesses the pagans and makes them kill each other. Shortly afterwards, the demon child arrived and expelled the evil spirits. The surviving pagans who saw the incident assumed that Casca was a witch and prostrated to worship her. Meanwhile, Joachim apparently managed to survive after falling from a cliff, and the mysterious observer watched him for a moment before finally leaving. The next day, Luca is surprised by the people who keep coming and giving gifts to Casca because they think she is a witch who can save them from the cruelty of Mazgas. On the other hand, Nina was afraid that Mazgas and the Holy Iron Chain Knights would arrest and punish them if Casca stayed with them. Nina then asks Luca to leave Casca. However, Luca firmly refused Nina's request. Not long after that, they received news that one of their friends, a girl named Pepe, had been arrested by the Holy Iron Chain Knights for committing a sin. Luca then rushed there and helped Pepe, who was being whipped by one of the knights. But then, Guts arrives there and saves them both while asking the man about a woman with a chest mark. Since the knight knew absolutely nothing about Casca, Guts killed him and slaughtered the other knights. Knowing that Guts was looking for Casca, Luca then told him that she knew the woman Guts was looking for and took him to her tent. On the other hand, Nina, who was so scared that sooner or later, the news about Casca having the markings of a witch would be found out by the Holy Iron Chain Knights, then rushed to take Casca away from there before she caused them all big trouble. Luca and Guts finally arrived and found the tent empty, indicating that Nina intended to run away by taking Casca away from there. Nina and Casca accidentally meet the pagans who apparently intend to kidnap Casca because their leader wants to make her his bride. Meanwhile, Guts and the others then split up to look for Casca's whereabouts. Isidoro and Puck, who were exploring the refugee camp near the hill, accidentally saw two women who were about to be taken away by a group of people. Thinking that one of the women might be the woman Guts was looking for, they both decided to follow them. Elsewhere, Farnese is visited by Joachim, who confesses that he has been kidnapped by the pagans and then tells the location of the pagans' hideout. Not only that, but Farnese also got word from one of her men who told her that Guts had arrived there and killed several knights. Knowing Guts' presence there, Farnese couldn't help feeling both angry and ashamed at herself for almost surrendering her chastity to Guts. However, this time she had to focus on stopping the actions of the pagans who dared to take the risk of holding a devil worship ritual around the area of the Holy Land, which was always blessed by God. Long story short, Isidoro and Puck finally arrive at the cave, where the pagans will begin the marriage ritual between Casca and their leader, the Great Goat. Casca is dressed so beautifully, while Nina will be used as a sacrifice in the ritual. Not just standing still, Isidoro then distracted the pagans by throwing stones at them. He was simply doing it to buy time while Puck rushed to tell Guts where Casca was. At the same time, Farnese and her knights arrived at the cave after following Joachim's instructions. However, they were surprised by the pagans who suddenly went crazy and attacked them all. It turned out that the pagans had been possessed by the evil spirits because they were attracted by the marks on Casca's body, so a fierce battle between the Holy Iron Chain Knights and the pagans was inevitable. Seeing Casca and Nina surrounded by the pagans possessed by the evil spirits, Isidoro did not stay silent and rushed to save the two of them. On the other hand, the Great Goat and his followers tried to escape by going through a gap in the cave wall. But then, the mysterious observer suddenly appeared and turned the Great Goat into a bloodthirsty beast that then attacked Farnese and her knights blindly. The Great Goat apparently intends to complete his marriage ritual with Casca and attempts to consummate their marriage. However, Guts, who finally arrived there, didn't just let it go and immediately attacked the Great Goat to save Casca. With a single slash of his greatsword, Guts can slay anyone who gets in his way to get Casca. Guts then told Isidoro to take Casca and Nina away through a gap in the cave wall while he would face the Great Goat, who turned out to be quite difficult to beat after gaining demonic powers. However, Guts succeeded in overthrowing the Great Goat in the end, and unbeknownst to him, the mysterious observer had been observing their fight for a long time. When Guts goes through a gap in the cave wall to catch up with Isidoro and the others, he is confronted by Serpico, who wants to confront him from the start because he is the Black Swordsman. Although he looks weak and geeky, but Serpico turns out to have the ability to fight with a sword that is quite great. Even Guts admits it. Moreover, Serpico also fought using his intelligence, so that some of the attacks he launched were completely unpredictable for Guts, and several times caused Guts to be cornered. However, Serpico still underestimated Guts because he did not predict that Guts would block his sword attack with his own hands. When the situation is desperate, Serpico slyly steals the explosives brought by Guts and manages to escape from his attack by hiding behind rocks. Meanwhile, Isidoro and the others arrived at the end of what turned out to be a dead end. However, they found a rope long enough, which they could use to descend to the bottom of the abyss. Nina, who had already arrived at the bottom of the abyss, was surprised by Joachim's appearance, who immediately went to inform Farnese and her knights of Nina's whereabouts. Not long after, Farnese and her knights arrived there and immediately arrested Nina. Seeing that her friend was caught, Casca did not stay silent and tried to help her, although in the end, she was also captured by Farnese and her knights. Isidoro, who was still on the cliff, then went into hiding and couldn't do anything because he didn't want to be caught. Guts, who arrived there and found out that Casca had been caught, then became angry and scolded Isidoro. However, Guts soon realized that Isidoro was just a boy who wouldn't be able to take on Farnese and her knights alone. That evening, Guts and Isidoro rushed to St. Albion, accompanied by Luca. In the monastery, Nina looks frustrated because of the misfortune that has befallen her after meeting Casca. However, seeing Casca, who doesn't understand anything because she has a mental illness, Nina then feels guilty and apologizes to her. Soon after, one of Mazgas's men arrived and took Nina away because he thought that Nina was the witch. Nina is taken to a torture chamber, where she will be punished for having allied with the devil worshippers. However, Nina tries to defend herself by telling them about the incident in the cave some time ago, and telling them that Casca is the real witch. Meanwhile, Guts finally arrived at St. Albion, sensing an extremely terrifying demonic presence in that place. With the help of Luca's acquaintance, they finally managed to infiltrate the church, where Guts then ran quickly to find Casca's whereabouts. On the other hand, Mazgas, who removed Casca's clothes and saw the marks on her body, firmly stated that Casca was a witch and ordered her executioners to torture her with an Iron Maiden. However, once Casca was placed in the Iron Maiden, the marks on her body awakened the spirits of the victims who died in the torture chamber, who have now become evil spirits because they harbored such deep hatred for Mazgas and his followers. Because of the large number of evil spirits who were victims of Mazga's torture, they could even coalesce and become a huge, terrible monsters. Farnese and the others tried to escape from there, ignoring Casca, who was slowly being swallowed up by the evil spirits. Meanwhile, Luca finally meets Jerome, who leads them through the halls of the church to find the whereabouts of Casca and Nina. Guts then ambushes Farnese and forces her to escort him to where they are holding Casca. Arriving at the torture chamber, Guts and Farnese were shocked when they saw the people who didn't have time to escape had melted into a very pathetic condition. Puck then tells Guts that Casca was not injured in the evil spirit's attack because she was apparently protected by the demon child. Elsewhere, Luca and the others managed to find the whereabouts of Nina locked up in prison and instantly free her. However, when they were about to head to the torture chamber to save Casca, they were confronted by a terrible monster who was a collection of evil spirits. Meanwhile, Mazgas, who was already in a state of urgency, was visited by the mysterious observer, who then gave him demonic powers. However, Mazgas thought that the power he had just obtained was a gift from God because he had been his obedient servant all this time, and still thought that Casca was a cult witch who should be punished immediately. Luca and the others try to save Casca from the hands of Mazgas. However, Mazgas could share his demonic power with his executioners, so they became pressed and caused Luca to fall from a height. Nina and Jerome tried to grab Luca's hand, but she chose to sacrifice herself rather than make Nina and the others fall to the bottom of the abyss. When Luca had given up on her life, suddenly appeared the Skull Knight who rushed to save her. At the same time, Guts arrives there and manages to save Nina and the others. When trying to save Casca, who is now being held captive by Mazgas, Guts immediately finds out that Mazgas and his executioners have obtained demonic powers, just like the Great Goat, so Guts is quite overwhelmed against them. Meanwhile, the Skull Knight who had saved Luca brought her to the bottom of the ravine on the edge of St. Albion, which turned out to be where Mazgas dumped the bodies of torture victims. The Skull Knight then dismounted from his horse and drew his sword towards the darkness before him as if challenging the mysterious observer who had always been hiding in the dark. The mysterious observer finally showed his true form, which turned out to be an egg, which we will later refer to as the egg, with a pair of eyes that always lurk in the dark. The egg confirmed that the bottom of the abyss was where he lived and then attacked the Skull Knight. However, the attack is only to distract the Skull Knight because the egg kidnaps Luca and takes the woman to his hiding place, which is a cave with a worship altar filled with burning candles. Luca then asked the egg about him, but the egg simply said that he was nobody and never was. The egg then tells that he used to be a man who was always hated and ostracized by everyone because of his physical disability, until one day, he fell to the bottom of a ravine on the outskirts of St. Albion and was buried by the bodies of victims of Mazgas' torture that were thrown into the abyss. In his downfall, he beheld a highly spiritual stone object used primarily for summoning the god Hand, who promises to grant any wish. He then expressed his wish, namely to incubate a perfect world because according to him, the world they live in now is too dilapidated with destruction and chaos happening everywhere. The man then sacrificed himself by turning into an egg to create the world he wanted. Meanwhile, Guts is still involved in a fierce battle against Mazgas' executioners. At the same time, Mazgas is about to carry out his usual torture rituals to punish women who are considered devil-worshipping witches. Isidoro and Puck tried to stop Mazgas, but he didn't budge, so their efforts were in vain. The scene turns back to Luca, who in the end, finds out that her meeting with Casca and the woman's decision to take Casca to the refugee camp in St. Albion turned out to be destined to fulfill a great prophecy about a savior figure, the Falcon of Light, who would appear soon. Not long after, the Skull Knight finally arrived there to save Luca. However, the egg did not fight because he had fulfilled his duty and chose to tell Luca everything because he wanted someone to listen to him and acknowledge his existence. After the egg flees with only a mortal wound he inflicts on the apostle, the Skull Knight takes Luca to safety as the living mounds of starved corpses rise up. After going through a fierce battle against the executioners of Mazgas, Guts was finally able to defeat them all. However, the evil spirits that had coalesced into monstrous monster forms began to fill the Tower of Conviction and caused the place to slowly begin to crumble. It was a sign of how great the hatred of the countless victims of Mazgas' atrocities that they now rose up and tried to avenge what he had done. However, hatred and revenge spread so quickly, especially when the evil spirits also began to enter the refugees and caused massive chaos in the refugee camps. While the refugees who managed to survive the evil spirits flocked to St. Albion, trying to find shelter in that place. Guts, as well as the Skull Knights and the Holy Iron Chain Knights, must now face the same enemy and think of a way to stop the evil spirits' attacks. When Azan and his knights were crushed by the attacks of the monsters and refugees who had been possessed by the evil spirits, Mazgas then arrived there. They destroyed some of the evil spirits with his power while lecturing about the power of God and the faith they should have in their hearts so as not to fall into a stray. Mazgas then showed his strength and said that all of that was the power of God, so that all who saw him kneeled down and praised God's majesty. Mazgas then said he would punish Casca because she was the witch who caused all the chaos in Saint Albion, and ordered everyone to execute Casca if they wanted to end the chaos and be free from suffering. Guts, who heard this, then tried to save Casca, but he is instead blocked by the evil spirits who unite to form the four angels. With his greatsword, Guts tried to slash the evil spirits, but the attack was completely ineffective. On the other hand, the egg, who was lamenting his fate and was about to die from fulfilling his duty, saw the figure of the demon child dying after being attacked by Mazgas while he was protecting Casca from the evil spirits. The egg, who felt sympathy for the demon child, then swallowed the figure and protected him until the end of his life. Meanwhile, the Skull Knight, who had brought Luca quite a distance from Saint Albion, asks Luca to stay there because of the great chaos that is going on in Saint Albion. However, Luca refuses because she wants to save her friends who are still in Saint Albion and then rushed to go there. When Casca was placed on a pole, Isidoro then tried to save Casca with help from Jerome and Nina. In the end, Isidoro and the others managed to save Casca and take her away from there. Mazgas, who saw that, then became angry and tried to attack them. However, Guts got there just in time, and because Mazgas was caught off guard, Guts managed to land a fatal blow on him. Unexpectedly, Mazgas turned out to be transformed into a terrible monster who, ironically, still carries the name of God for everything he does. Farnese, who saw Mazgas's terrifying form, wondered if he had really obtained God's power because his appearance and actions did not reflect the figure of a savior angel at all and instead looked like a demon who wanted to destroy mankind. At the same time, Isidoro and the others are attacked by one of Mazgas's surviving executioners, which causes Nina to fall from a height. However, with Isidoro's clever wits and Puck's fairy powers, they finally succeeded in overthrowing the executioner. Meanwhile, the evil spirits, which blended into a giant spirit wave, rushed towards the Tower of Conviction to devour the refugees still holding out there. Everyone seemed to be clapping their hands together while praying to God. In the fight, Mazgas asked Guts to see how everyone became obedient and prayed to their God. However, Guts says they only pray for their own safety, and salvation will not come if they sacrifice someone just because they don't want to be the victim. Hearing Guts' words, Mazgas then became angry because he underestimated someone's faith and told him to repent. But Guts paid no heed to that and then attacked Mazgas with a vengeance. However, the attack seemed to have no effect on Mazgas. When Guts looked exhausted, suddenly Mazgas's body exploded because it turned out that Guts had secretly placed his explosives in several gaps in Mazgas's body. He then grabbed his sword and in the end, managed to kill Mazgas, whose body burned and fell in the middle among the refugees. However, the death of Mazgas did not necessarily destroy or stop the attacks of the evil spirits who finally arrived there and devoured the refugees near them. Knowing that Mazgas' burning corpse could ward off the evil spirits' attacks, Guts and the others, including Farnese and Serpico, gathered the wood around them and made torches to ward off the evil spirits' attacks, hoping that they would last until the sun rose the next day. Meanwhile, Nina, who fell from a height, managed to survive. However, a group of people trying to save themselves from being chased by the evil spirits headed toward her. Luckily, Luca got there in time and then saved Nina. After that, she told Nina to hide in the barrel while she looked for another hiding place. As Guts and his companions fend off the flood of corpses with fire, while Luca saves Nina down below the tower, the egg calls the dead to the Tower of Conviction. He sacrifices himself to complete the ritual with the demon child becoming Griffith's corporeal vessel. The resurrection event caused the Tower of Conviction to collapse and killed everyone on board. At the same time, dawn broke on the eastern horizon and the evil spirits disappeared as the sun shone on the area. Guts and his companions survived, as did Nina and Luca, who tried to escape their hiding place. However, when they finally regrouped, they were surprised by the appearance of Silet, his clans, and the Kushan army surrounding them. Silet apparently also had a vision of what would happen at the Tower of Conviction, so he and his men rushed to Saint Albion. Silet then ordered the Kushan army to capture Guts and his companions, so a fierce battle between them was inevitable. With the help of Azan, who survived, Guts and his companions tried to fight the Kushan army and protect Casca. But then, the Skull Knight appeared along with Zod, who didn't care about the battle and then pointed towards behind them, where the Falcon of Light, or the Savior who manifested in the form of Griffith, was currently at. Everyone seemed astonished to see the appearance of the Falcon of Light, which had been foretold and implied in the dreams of the residents of Midland. Zod rushed over to Griffith, then knelt before him and devoted himself as Griffith's servant because he was the Falcon of Light who was predicted to be the strongest in the world. On the other hand, Casca showed a strange reaction when she saw Griffith, as if she wanted to approach him. Guts then tried to restrain Casca, stole a nearby horse, and then rushed to bring her back to Goto's home. Meanwhile, the much larger Kushan army was seen flocking to St. Albion, so Isidoro and the others rushed away from there, and Zod flew away with Griffith. When they were in a safe place, Luca plucked a few flower stalks that she offered to the egg for his sacrifices and the refugees who died in the terrible events last night. Meanwhile, Nina finally reunited with Joachim, who survived. Afterwards, Isidoro then said goodbye to all of them because he was going to rush after Guts and Casca. On the other hand, Farnese decided to give up her title as the Holy Iron Chain Knight and follow Guts because she felt confident that Guts could lead her to the right path. Back at St. Albion's ruins, the Skull Knight muses that the events which occurred will soon change the world. The moral we can learn from this anime is that we really can't rely on anyone but ourselves in this world. However, that does not mean we can deny the power of God working in His own way, because if we know how God manages everything in our lives, our hearts will be filled with love for Him.